From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. One evening in November of 1955, a man planted a bomb aboard a United Airlines plane shortly before it departed from Denver. The plane exploded in mid-flight over Weld County, killing all 44 people aboard. It was a mass murder that grabbed headlines across the country. But if you've never heard of this crime, you're hardly alone. There's no marker at the site of the crash near what is now Firestone. However, a local nonprofit group wants to change that. The Flight 629 Memorial Committee wants to create a marker to honor the lives lost in the tragedy. They hope to complete it before the 70th anniversary of the tragedy, which will happen in 2025. To get a better sense of the bombing and its legacy, we reached out to Andrew J. Field. He's a retired staff attorney for the Colorado Supreme Court, where he specialized in criminal law. And he's the author of the book, Mainliner Denver, The Bombing of Flight 629. Andrew, welcome to In The NoCo.
Thank you for having me.
There are folks who live near the area where the crash happened and families of victims who want to memorialize this tragedy. What kinds of stories have you heard from the victims' families over the years?
I am constantly amazed that this many years on, I still occasionally receive emails from relatives of the victims. At this point, it's another generation on. I think for most of the victims, one of the great sadnesses of this incident is that it has not been remembered. There have been different efforts over the years to establish memorials. It would be a wonderful thing if there was something of sufficient magnitude to call people's attention to it.
And I think it's important to remember, too, it's not just the people who were on the flight who were killed, but it had to be just harrowing and so traumatic for the people who owned the beet farms nearby, where the plane went down, and finding pieces of the wreckage on fire, as you write about in your book.
Absolutely. I mean, if you think about it now, if an event like this were to occur, the first people would be the paramedics and the police, and then immediately after that, you'd have the victim counselors and the witness counselors, trained therapists, helping these people cope with their trauma. None of that occurred.
I don't want the bomber to get too much time in this segment, so I want to cover this kind of quickly. But the perpetrator's mother had a ticket for this flight. He hid dynamite in her suitcase and set a timer to detonate in the air. Were airplane bombings like this more common, or were they easier to pull off back then?
Well, this was the first bombing of a commercial aircraft in the United States. And to give you a sense of just how novel it was, after John Gilbert Graham had confessed and they went to charge him, they opened up the federal law books and discovered that there was no federal statute which made it a crime to blow up an airplane. And so that's why they charged it in state court.
Okay. So I take it there weren't really security measures in place at the airport to prevent something like this from happening?
Not only were there not security measures at the airport, it was half a century before there were meaningful security measures at most airports. It really was the case that for many years you could walk onto an airplane with pretty much anything you wanted. It was only after 9/11 that the Federal Aviation authorities really got serious about security.
We know the perpetrator purchased a life insurance policy for his mother and hoped to collect the insurance payout after the plane crashed. The life insurance policy was acquired from a vending machine in the airport, which is something I have never seen when I have traveled. Did this cause the end of flight insurance vending machines?
I'm old enough to remember flight insurance vending machines, and the initial purpose of them was to instill confidence in nervous travelers who were making their transition from the rails to the air for the first time as air travel in the 1950s began to compete seriously with rail travel. And the idea was that if you could sell somebody life insurance, it would put their mind at ease. And also, the premiums were incredibly cheap. You put a quarter in the machine and you could get several $1,000s of insurance for it. And the idea being that if the premium's this cheap, that's the insurance company saying that there's virtually no probability that you're ever going to collect on this policy.
Ah, I see.
But what ultimately made them go away was the advent of life insurance for a purchased plane ticket being incorporated into credit cards. When you buy a plane ticket with your credit card, most of them include some type of a life insurance benefit.
Why do you think it's important not to let United 629 disappear without a memorial?
I think that in a state like Colorado, where you have a regular turnover of the population, I think the forgetting of it so completely is a more recent thing. In the old days, it was an annual event in both the Denver Post and the Rocky Mountain News that on November 1st, in that, on this day section, every year there was a mention of the bombing.
And so within the last 20 years, after the 50th anniversary, it's kind of fallen off of people's memories, I guess.
Well, frankly, the people who remembered, a lot of them passed away in that interim.
We a lot of times think of events like this in terms of the legacy they leave behind. What is the legacy of United Flight 629?
I would say that if 100 years from now, people are looking back at and asking, what was it about this case that was important, that they would say, first and foremost, it changed the law regarding televised coverage of criminal trials and sort of was the blueprint for the idea of having a trial of the century, which there had been before with the Lindbergh kidnapping and that type of thing.
Sure.
But to have it available to everybody at 6:00 in their living room in black and white was a completely different thing. And I think it will also be remembered as sort of the end of a period of innocence in aviation, the end of a period of sort of sweet naivete about what this newfangled method of transportation was capable of. And it was the first time involving a commercial flight that the country woke up to the notion, which horribly was brought home in 2001 in even grander scale, that commercial aviation could be used for horribly wicked purposes.
Well, Andrew J. Field is author of the book Mainliner Denver, The Bombing of Flight 629. Andrew, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for calling attention to the work of the people who are establishing this memorial. I think it's important.
If you want to read more, we've linked to a Greeley Tribune article about the Flight 629 memorial efforts. And we'll have a link to learn more about the book Mainliner Denver. Find that at KUNC.org or in the show notes of this podcast. That's it for us today on In The NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thank you so much for listening.